My mother has lived a rough life. She lost most of her family to the eruption of Nevado del Ruiz in '85. She lost her first child, my older sister, in '91 to a traffic accident. She lost my father, a civil servant, to a kidnapping gone wrong in '99. I was only 2 years old when he died, so all my memories of him are held in faded pictures in flimsy frames. But my mother swore to keep me and my younger sister out of trouble. She swore we would have a good life and that we should keep looking ahead. She had this saying that her grandmother used to tell her, something that is rarely heard outside small rural communities. Hell, I don't know, maybe it's just our family that keeps saying it. It goes, "No one returns from the jaguar." It's an idiom meaning, what's gone is gone. It means you have to let go and to step away from what's already happened. I grew up in a small community southeast of Bogota. We had a brick house painted a forest green, with these black diamond spots along the front steps. Just passing through, you could easily see where I lived. Mom was the manager at a trucking company, managing timetables, payment, and scheduling. It was a great job, and she often reminded us of how blessed we were. There were only a couple hundred people living in that community, but it was peaceful, and we were close enough to the big city to get most modern amenities, if we could afford it. We didn't have much, all things considered, but we were happy there. I would help my neighbor run a fruit stand by the northbound road. Tired husbands coming home from work would stop there to buy fruit on the way home. If you were friendly enough, they'd give you a tip. When my younger sister Viviana was 15, she helped out at a hair salon up north. It wasn't well paid, but it gave her enough to get a taste of independence. She was good at it, too. She usually helped out the younger girls who came in to get their hair dyed. You ever seen that rainbow faded dye on TikTok? She did that years ago, and through it all, Mom kept us out of trouble. Our community stayed out of conflicts, and we kept our heads down. We were just something you passed by on your way to something important. No one cared to stop where we lived. It served us well. But in the fall of 2016, Viviana disappeared. My mom had been careful. We had tracking software on our phones, and we checked in once a day whenever we were out of town. But despite it all, Viviana disappeared. The last ping of her phone showed her heading east out of Bogota. And then, nothing. I did everything I could. I asked everyone. I put up posters. I asked the authorities, and I called the police every day. But she was gone. My mother mourned for months. I don't think she ever stopped. She would cry herself to sleep, and she would talk with the priest every day. But she didn't help me look, and she didn't ask any questions. Whenever I asked for her help, she would recite that core tenet of her belief. No one returns from the jaguar. To her, Viviana was gone, and all hope was lost. As an only child, there was a lot of pressure on me. I got my formal education in system development and an internship at a large telecom company in East Medellin, where I eventually moved. My mother didn't want to go. She stayed in her greenhouse with the black diamonds. I would send her money out of my paycheck every month, and we would talk every week. To this day, she lives there. I think she runs the trucking company by now. I had years to deal with the loss of Viviana, but it was difficult. I still light a candle on her birthday, and I keep her in my prayers. My mother dealt with it much better than I did. She could speak about Viviana openly, but I could never get over the way she talked about her in the past tense. To me, not knowing what happened to her meant that we could never know for sure if she was gone. To hear my mother speak about her as if she was dead bothered me. That is until late October 2023. We were called into a meeting in the early morning. I work in a team of 6, mostly in troubleshooting and monitoring telecommunication outages. We coordinate service teams to make sure the larger population centers retain the best coverage, basically. My boss showed us a map of the southeastern region of our service. There was mostly jungle there, but we still had spots of coverage. There was a red circle over the map, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. We've been getting complaints about this all day, my boss said. All last night, too. People are getting automated calls from this area. What's the source? A colleague asked. They're using spoofed numbers. We're not sure what's up, but it can't be good. They running a scam? My boss shrugged. He knew about as much as we did. We got to work, and a couple of things didn't line up. There were indeed calls going out, but there was never anything said or sold. There was no one on the other end of the line. All calls were coming from a general area, but not the same source. It's as if there were hundreds, if not thousands of phones in a concentrated area. They seemed to be moving as well. The sources were shifting to the southwest. It didn't take long for us to notice a worrying trend. The numbers used. They weren't just one-time payphones, they were old and registered accounts that remained in our systems. We worked overtime trying to plug the holes and provide the authorities with information they needed to make arrests, but it was proving more difficult than anticipated. Not only was there not a single source to point at, but they were constantly on the move, and we still had no idea what was going on. But things took a turn. The numbers being used belonged to people who'd gone missing over the past 10 years. It's as if they'd come back to life. There had to be a scam involved, but we couldn't figure out what or how. We had no idea how they got a hold of that many phones and accounts, and there was still nothing being sold. I couldn't help but to ask myself a painful question. I didn't want an answer, but I had to seek it anyway. Turns out, Viviana's number had been pinged in that area. I had to do something. My sister had an app to locate her phone installed, courtesy of my mother. It was one thing to get a ping on her phone or her number, but if I could get a location from the app, that meant it wasn't just someone spoofing her number. It was her actual phone. That meant that whoever ran this scam had, at one point, been in touch with her, or the people who took her. It was hard to get a hold of the login information, and most of the software had devolved into outdated legacy versions, but we could get it to run. My colleagues helped me set up an emulator, and within a couple of hours, there I was, hunched over my keyboard at 1 a.m. with a bag of chocolitos, listening to the rain. And it came back positive. I got a ping. It really was Viviana's phone. The next few days, I called everyone. I called friends and family. I called the authorities. And of course, I called my mother. I told her Viviana's phone was active, and that we could find out what happened. I told her we wouldn't have to wonder anymore. But of course, all I got was silence and that age-old adage. No one returns from the Jaguar. I tried to get in touch with the MPSU, Missing Persons Search Unit. Thing is, they weren't touching this one. As long as it was considered a telecommunication hoax or a scam, it was up to local law enforcement. But so far, there had been no crime reported. It was just empty phone calls. No one was selling anything. There were no threats. No one was pretending to be anyone. It was just noise over the airwaves. Still, I wasn't the only one who'd noticed that the numbers were familiar. We got calls from worried relatives of these missing people. I got a call directly to my work phone from a worried father, begging me to help him find his long-missing son. We compiled a list of people who had relatives coming back online in that area. Over just 3 days, that list grew to about 35 families. And those were only the ones who identified themselves. And still, we couldn't get the authorities to investigate. I know it's a lottery. It all depends on who picks up the phone. But the authorities had been getting enough calls to turn their backs on it completely. Unless something urgent showed up, they wouldn't lift a finger. So I had to make a drastic decision. The way things were looking, the source was going to cross into either Peru or Western Brazil in a matter of weeks, easily before the end of the rain season. So if I wanted answers, I would have to do something myself. I took some time off work and called everyone on the list. I explained to them who I was, and that I wanted to follow the source and see for myself. A lot of people supported it, but others were skeptical. They thought this was part of the scam. Still, a few people were as desperate as I. There was a man named Hader whose wife had gone missing 4 years ago, and he hadn't been able to get over her. He was ready to do anything. There was also an older man named Brian, who had an older brother who'd gone missing. He also knew an honest guide who could get us to that location. It would cost a lot of money and time. You don't want to travel during rain season, but we didn't have a choice. It would last all November, and by the end of it, that source would have crossed the border. We had to act fast if we wanted answers. There was also the talk of bringing weapons. I've never held a weapon all my life. My mom made sure of it. Hader didn't speak a lot about it, but he seemed to have some live combat experience. He also had some weapons stashed away. He brought along 2 handguns. After a few days of preparation, the three of us met up just south of Bogota. Brian had gotten us a proper off-road vehicle. Hader had weapons, food, and water. I brought tracking equipment and GPS. Brian was almost 50 years old, but you couldn't tell. He had this youthful appearance. The only thing that gave it away was his 1,000-yard stare and half a dozen gray hairs on his chin. Hader was just a couple of years older than me. He had this long wild hair and thick glasses that looked like telescope lenses. He was a full head taller than me, but was thin as a stick. He could easily be mistaken for a geek, but he was probably the one with the most violent past. We could get pretty close to the source with a 12-hour drive. I don't think a lot of people realize just how large the Colombian countryside is, and we were going to a specific site. We couldn't just chase the target, we had to get ahead of it, so we followed my calculations. I'm not going to bore you with the drive itself. We offered to take turns, but Brian wouldn't have it. It was his car, his music, and his responsibility to get us there. He wouldn't have it any other way. I ended up chatting with Hader most of the time. He told me all about his wife Luciana and how great she'd been, how he hadn't given up on finding her after all these years. Stars don't disappear from the sky, he argued. There are just clouds in the way. If anything, he was excited. This was the answer to his prayer, and me reaching out to him was a gift. Even if she was dead, at least he'd have answers. The further south you go, the bigger the potholes get. You have to be ready for anything. The roads would turn into a muddy sludge. You might lose a couple nuts and bolts along the way, but help is never far away. I've yet to see the country folk turn their back on a broken-down car. But this time we were lucky. We made our way through the rain unscathed. We came to the end of the road and parked in a clearing. Our guide was already there, a man named Andres. He usually worked with tourists, which you could sort of tell from the way he spoke. He'd throw in the occasional English word to sort of make a point of things. He was younger than me, full of energy, and was nothing but excited. I think he was putting on a bit of a show. Most of that faded about an hour in. So we made our way into the jungle. We were on schedule and set to intercept the source of the signal in about 18 to 26 hours, depending on the weather. When people think jungle, they think of explorers with sand-colored hats chopping down bushes and saplings with machetes. Real life is very different. Now, I didn't have a lot of experience in that environment, but I knew what to do and not to do. There were paths to follow, and there were things to look for. You don't need to take out the machete for everything. It all depends on who's in front. And with Andres taking point, we were in good hands. Despite being dressed for the rain, everything gets wet. You'll get water in your boots, so your feet start to blister. The rain will bring the sweat down from your brow and into your eyes, stinging you with the salt. Sure, there will be less bugs, but they'll still be around. Most of the trails we followed were from illegal farmers who occupied parts of the jungle back in the 80s and 90s, but most of the old campsites were abandoned and overgrown. But we would still find little spaces where we could stop to rest or set up camp for the night. We stopped for the night at one of the campsites. We set up tents and ate canned goods. Andres had picked something up along the way, but I didn't quite have that kind of confidence in him to eat what he offered. You don't want to get sick out in the middle of nowhere. Luckily, I got a good tent and not the cheap stuff. I didn't have to worry about ants or mosquitoes. Still, the rain continued well into the night. It was deafening. Lying there, I loaded up my tracking equipment and, just as expected, we were on schedule. Even now, the source was moving. At all hours of the day, they were moving. And even now, somehow, they were making calls. How the hell could they do that on such a scale? I fell in and out of sleep that night, imagining noises outside. I pictured eyes in the dark, considering what to do with me. There was wilderness an arm's reach away. Could be anything. While jaguars aren't as much of a threat as they might once have been, that didn't make my mother's words any less true, in a sense. No one returns from the jaguar. The next morning, my muscles ached. It's one thing to walk along a paved road, but following old trails challenges every part of your body. Still, we had to keep going if we were to make it on time. Checking the tracker, the source had moved all night. If we kept a good pace, we would meet them either late at night or early the next morning. We had a couple of dry hours, so we made the most of it. We ate on the go and kept our heads down. No chit-chat. Andres would stop to make a few videos, but considering his price, we let him do pretty much whatever he wanted. He still kept a good pace, even though he couldn't wipe that stupid smile off his face. The man was obsessed with his phone and always kept it on. I did see a couple of things that hinted at the history of the path. Overgrown, unmarked wooden crates, a couple of plastic barrels, and at one point a jeep. I think it was a government vehicle. It had been stripped of its seats and wheels, and it didn't have a license plate. It didn't have any identifying traits at all. It had probably been stranded there for well over a decade, and had become the home to a spider the size of my hand. I did notice a couple of strange things though, like a laptop charger on the passenger seat. Andres got a couple of good pictures of it. Military? Brian asked. No, said Hader. Corporate. How can you tell? It's too well made. That got a chuckle out of Andres. By the afternoon, the rain was back. We followed a small river to get out of the vegetation. Andres cut us some heart of palm for a midday snack. I could tell they were all excited to see what was waiting for us at the end of the line. Hader could barely keep his mouth shut, and Brian seemed to get grumpier and grumpier. And me? Well, I couldn't stop looking ahead. I felt like there was always something waiting around the corner. At one point, Andres stopped us. His smile faded, and we huddled around him. He had to raise his voice to be heard over the rain. We can keep going straight, but it's tough ground, he said. Or we go around. What about the river? Brian asked. Can't we cross it? Not in the rain, Andres said. What do you want to do? We looked at one another, shaking our heads. We couldn't break the schedule. We keep going, I said. We trust you. Andres grinned at us and nodded. Lot of wasps up ahead. Keep the lights off. The ground turned muddy, and the trees grew taller and closer. The bushes were thicker, and we had to step over fallen logs and branches with every step we took. We would trip, cut ourselves, and get our feet drenched. There were no trails to follow, but we were still making good time. The rain would come and go hour by hour, and at times it'd be so much rain it looked like we were walking into a wall of water. It also gets real dark real fast. It's hard to explain how dark it gets, but we had to keep going, and we had to keep the lights to a minimum. There are these yellow paper wasps that go straight for the light and end up stinging you in the face, but the few I noticed had this vivid shade of red. Andres didn't have a lot to say about them. With the lights off, they left us alone. By the end of the day, we were miserable. The source had picked up speed and was slowly moving away. If we didn't want to run into them in the middle of the night, we had to make camp again. If we did, we could get there before lunch the next day. We made camp again and ate in silence. The rain came and went in waves all night long, but all I saw was the light of the tracker. I was getting some interference, but that was only natural. We were way out in the middle of nowhere. I checked our updated logs showing outgoing calls. Viviana had made a call. A single call to my mom. It stung my heart. My mom might seem cold to an outsider, but she cares more than anyone. It is one thing to go your entire life saying how important it is to let things go, and another thing to have that thing call on your phone. I would have to talk to her when I got back. All night long, I kept hearing this one bird. It was large and must have had a nest right above us. It had this call like a stalling engine and a hysterical laugh. I couldn't help but think it was mocking us, like it knew what was waiting up ahead. The next morning, we were in a hurry. We were anxious to get answers. Hader double-checked his weapons and handed the other one to Brian. Andres looked nervous, but didn't object. We ate breakfast on the go, using the last of our pre-filled water bottles along the way. The rain clouds were weighing heavy overhead. I could feel the thunder in the air, like a physical presence. It was just a matter of hours before we'd be back in the pouring rain. We were following an old trail. We diverged from the river and went up to more elevated ground. The tracker was pointing at a nearby hill. We could almost see it. It really started to sink in that this was real. Someone there had to know something, and we were going to get answers. But it worried me just how far Hader and Brian were prepared to go to get these answers. They seemed like nice guys, but you don't really know people until you've seen them under pressure. So we made our final effort up the hill. The trees spread out as if to make way. 2 hours later, we were just around the bend. There was a circling path up the hill. The tracker had stopped, showing our target wasn't moving anymore. Hader was getting ready, hiding his pistol under his rain jacket. Brian had stuffed it down his belt. Andres had lagged behind a bit, giving us the space to move ahead. He didn't want to get involved. The trees eventually opened into a small glade ahead. This was it. Someone had clearly been there recently. There was a large metal generator connected to a kind of radio antenna or mobile tower. It had been placed in the middle of the glade for the best reception. "They have to come back for this soon," Hader mumbled. "This is expensive equipment." "You know what it is?" I asked. "I think it's a range extender," he said, "for troops to retain communication in remote areas." "But it's not on," added Brian. "The generator is off." It was strange. According to my tracker, this thing was on. And not only that, but there were dozens, if not hundreds of signals coming from this area. Something was off. We waited for the better part of an hour, and the rain started to come down again. I got a closer look at the electronics. Now, I'm no expert, but a couple of things weren't lining up. First of all was the generator. It didn't have any fuel, and there was no direct connection between the generator and the antenna. The antenna was about 10 feet tall, with 2 satellite dishes on top. There were 4 metal rods holding them up, with support of crisscross welded supports. It looked homemade, if anything, but professional still. It was clearly built to a specification, but I couldn't tell for what purpose. There were no wires reaching down from the satellite dishes. There was no power being run through it. I couldn't figure it out. The only thing that made any kind of remote sense was the idea that they hadn't finished installing it. But if that was the case, how could something still be transmitted from that area? Brian was furious. He was circling the glade, looking for tracks. Hader was pacing back and forth, looking at me for answers. Andres stayed on the trail, waiting eagerly to start the walk back to the car. It wouldn't take long now that we knew where to go. "It has to be here," Brian called out. "They wouldn't just leave it." "Maybe they're hiding," Hader called back. "Maybe they saw us." "That's not it," I said, shaking my head. "It's still transmitting." "Then where are they?" Brian yelled. "Where are the phones? How the hell do they move this thing?" It was a good question. The generator had wheels, so it could be rolled, but there were no tracks leading up to it. It's as if they'd carried it there, which must have been a hassle and a half. That thing easily weighed 150, maybe 160 pounds. And that wasn't counting the 10 feet tall transmitter. We spent some time just going through the glade and anything near it. Brian didn't find anything in particular, but then again, he was barely looking. He was pissed, and he made no intention of hiding it. Hader, on the other hand, went a bit further. He couldn't find anything either. Well, except for a cool patch of flowers he wanted to show. "They kind of look like sunflowers," he said. "But blue." The answers had to be right there, staring us in the face. Looking a bit closer at the generator, I find pieces of a logo etched on the side. It looked like the head of an axe. I'd never seen it before, and neither had the others. Finally, Brian had an idea. He had to yell it out to overpower the increasing rain. "Let's just move it," he said. "We move it and they'll come looking." It was as good an idea as anything. Hader took point, grabbing the generator like a wheelbarrow, while I looked at unscrewing the antenna. Hader came to a sudden stop. He'd barely nudged the generator and it was stuck. There was a pair of thick cables running on the underside of it, digging into the ground. All 3 of us just stopped for a while, looking down. "There's something there," I said. "Something buried." "I didn't bring any shovels," Andres added. "No one said we'd be digging." "We're not," said Brian. "Fuck that. Let's just cut the cables and take it." Hader agreed. I wasn't so sure. Hader cut the cables using a machete, and we rolled the generator away. We decided to come back for the antenna later. Brian was on high alert as we made our way back down the hill. "We're staying one more night," Brian said. "If we don't see them in the morning, we'll burn this to the ground." "It's gonna cost extra," said Andres. "I have a schedule." "Fuck your schedule," added Brian. "I'll pay whatever you want, but I don't want any fucking stories." "Fine, nodded Andres. "You're the boss." We rolled the generator down the hill. By the time the rain eased up, we had cleared a new campsite. We covered the generator in some palm leaves and set up our tents, doing our best to keep the lights low. We didn't want them to come wandering into our campsite. We wanted them to expose themselves. We were going to keep watch, all three of us. We were expecting company, but we didn't know from what direction. Andres wasn't in on it. In his words, he was there to get us in and out. That was it. I couldn't blame him. He had no idea how far we were ready to go. Still, the way Brian waved around his gun, it was starting to look more like a mission of vengeance rather than information. I had first watched that night. I sat upright in my tent, looking at the tracking screen. The interference was worse than ever, but I could still see it. The transmission was still active. How could that be? The generator was gone. I turned off my phone to save some battery. We were going to be here longer than expected. Brian took my place in the middle of the night, and I went down like someone had turned the power off. I wasn't expecting anything to happen that night, but I still had this uneasy feeling weighing down my gut. But the wilds were still waiting there, just outside my tent. And that night, it had something to say. I woke up in the middle of the night. I didn't know why, and at first I didn't even realize I was awake. There was no rain, but plenty of birds and insects singing their hearts out. And yet, I could feel something was different. The sounds were different, colder. I peered over at the tracking device. Turns out the transmissions had moved. They'd made a sharp turn back east, down the hill, the same way we'd went. There was a loud groan coming from the jungle. You know the way when you move something heavy across a floor and it makes that hacking sound? It was something like that, like something heavy and metallic was dragged across a rubber floor. It was loud, like an instrument, rusted equipment swinging in the wind. Then, a gunshot. I rushed out of the tent, barely dressed. Hader was already up, gun in hand. I caught Andres peeking out of his tent, but he wasn't getting out anytime soon. There was no sign of Brian. Throwing caution to the wind, Hader turned on a flashlight. I followed suit. We scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there. I checked the ground only to see a patch of warm blood. It was spread out in an angle indicating a hit or movement. I pointed at it only to see Hader looking up. Turning my head up, I could see the antenna. It was rising out of the jungle, towering above the trees. It looked at least 5 to 10 feet taller. It was swaying in the wind, making a low, metallic, groaning noise. "They moved it," Hader whispered. "Why'd they move it?" "There's no one here," I whispered back. "Who did this?" Looking around, we saw no one. No people. No tracks. No footsteps. Then the antenna moved again. This time, it didn't just sway in the wind. It was being pushed closer to us. Hader turned the flashlight towards it. I only saw it for the blink of an eye, but the image imprinted on my mind. There was a mess of dirty cables. There were solar panels spread out like a blooming flower, with glass shards in the middle. Industrial-grade wires tangled into the mockery of a bush. Hundreds of old phones, still bright and active, lining the sides like the scales of a lizard. Little pieces interconnected in an unnatural web. It looked like a kind of body still covered in mud from being buried. It was carrying the antenna on its back like a massive shark's fin. The main body was at least 7 feet tall. Halfway up that antenna was Brian. His stomach and throat split open. His eyes were still flicking back and forth, trying to function without oxygen. He'd been stuck to solid pieces of rebar poking out of the antenna. He looked like an insect in a web or a fish on a drying rack. He was still bleeding. Hader raised his pistol, but it was too late. I heard something whip out, and there were 3 loud taps, like stones hitting a rotten log. Hader didn't get the time to pull the trigger before he'd been pushed to the ground and then dragged into the jungle. I sat down and turned my flashlight off. Crawling along the ground, I made my way back to my tent. I tried to keep a low profile. The metallic groaning grew louder as more weight was put on the antenna. I held my breath, waiting for that thing to go away. You can't just run into the jungle, that's insanity. You have to keep your cool. I couldn't have my mom lose all her children. I had to stay quiet and lucky. There was another spatter of rain on my tent, but it didn't sound right. Looking up, it looked too dark. Took me a couple of seconds to realize it wasn't rain, but blood. That thing was moving through our camp, passing by my tent as it went. There was a bright flash of light as 100, maybe 1,000, of phones lit up all at once. A cacophony of ringtones blared, like an electronic belly roar. And as it died down, a single ringtone remained. Andre's phone. I'd heard it once or twice since we met him. I could hear him complaining as he desperately tried to turn it off. He never could keep his hands off that thing. There was a moment of silence. Then the groaning began anew. "No," I heard. "No, I have nothing to do with this. I have nothing to dash." Plastic was torn apart. One long scream of primal pain going higher and higher up in the air. You'll never forget a sound like that. It's not like in the movies or the games. People don't care how they sound when they die. It's not cool or manly. It's desperate. It's high-pitched. And when it ends, it doesn't come back. There were sounds coming from the phones. Confused voices answering random calls. They were waking up, dazed and confused, not knowing what to say. "Hello," someone said. "How did you get Canda's number?" "Alejandro." But how can you dash?" Dozens of others. Name after name after name. Tears, anger, screaming, and finally, a voice I would recognize anywhere. My mom. "Viviana," she said. "It can't be you. Please tell me it can't be you." I had to bite my tongue to keep quiet, but a sob escaped me. I was shivering. My body wasn't getting enough oxygen, and my heart was beating out of my chest. I'd laid down on the ground of my tent, curled up in a fetal position. I tried to make myself small and invisible. Something poked at the tent. A steady pressure pushed through, breaking the top open. A long machete-like blade descended, poking around next to me, probing, testing. Then it touched the screen of my tracker and pushed down. It was like spearfishing, pierced straight through the tracker and pulled it up. All the while, I could hear my mother in a sea of voices. The light from the phones lit up the night like a torch, casting a long, shapeless shadow into my tent. I didn't stand a chance. I had to stay quiet. Then the phones turned off. All but one. Another number ringed as the dial tone struggled to connect. The sharp blade retracted as something heavy moved around the camp. It was looking for me. The call went through and someone answered. I almost choked on my own spit. It was Viviana. She sounded older, more confident, but I could tell it was her even now, all these years later. "Come out," she said. "Please come out." The antenna groaned as the thing bent down, tearing Brian's tent apart. "It wants to know how you found us," she continued. "It has questions. It means no harm." It groaned again and was followed by a meaty thud. Someone must have slid off the rebar, and their body hit the ground hard. Dead meat on the jungle floor, a feast for the ants in the morning. "Last chance, Mijo," she said. "You're making it angry." I grabbed my bag and turned on my phone. I held my fingers against the speaker to quiet the startup noise. But as soon as it went on, I was getting calls from unknown numbers. It was probing for me, looking for directions. So I got up, reached my hand out of the tent, and threw my phone into the jungle. There was a rush of activity. It was like a car driving through camp, running over and breaking anything in its path. Finally, I let my heart go wild. I slapped my boots on, grabbed my bag, and got out of the tent. I didn't even look back. I just headed the other way as fast as I could, running blindly into the dark. I made some ground, but it was coming back my way. I had to slow down and stay low. I had to sneak in the dark, doing my best not to brush up against anything brittle. It was almost impossible, but thankfully, that thing made more noise than I did. Then, the rain came back gradually. My first thought was that things couldn't possibly get any worse, but after a moment of hesitation, I realized something. The rain was masking my movement. If I was careful, I could move faster and further away. Couldn't hear me. The last thing I heard was that metallic groaning as the antenna moved back and forth. And somewhere in the distance, still, I heard Viviana's voice, cursing at me, begging for me to come back, questioning me. She was throwing everything at me, hoping to get me to turn back. I'll never forget the last thing she said. "You'll never know what happened. You'll never know." And of all the things said that night, that was the most true. I didn't sleep. I barely even saw the sun coming up. I only noticed by the songbirds sounding different and there being less mosquitoes. I'd found a trail, but I didn't recognize it. I was lost in the jungle with only a vague direction to follow. I got lucky that day. Mid-afternoon, close to dinner time, I ran into a group of tourists led by a man who looked a lot like Andres. I broke down completely. I barely remember what I told them, but one thing kept coming back to my mind. "Don't go looking for them," I begged. "Don't go looking. Please, don't." I took the man's hand, looked him in the eyes, and said what I'd been told so many times. No one returns from the jaguar. No one asked me any questions. No one came looking for them. Today, the calls are still coming in. We still get the pings on our trackers. But we all know not to go looking. Maybe some knew all along. People who call to complain are moved to a special line, and then they get cut off. Brian's number is on the list now. Haters and Andres too. Calls me with their numbers sometimes, just to see where I am. A couple of times it even speaks. It uses their voices. "Come back," it begs. "Come back to us." But I came home to my mom. I held her and I cried. When she asked where I'd been, I didn't have the heart to lie. "I went looking for her," I admitted. "I went to see her." "What did you find, son?" I searched my heart for the answer, and it was right there. It was there all along. I found the jaguar.